Welcome to Detour 365. This is William, the host, and I'm with Bill, Nathaniel. This is episode number 39. We're looking at Exodus 33, 7 through 11. And this is a slightly shorter passage than last time, of course, but we were looking at the golden calf. So this is immediately after that. We were in Exodus 32, now we're in 33. Exodus 33, 7 through 11. And Bill, you're going to be reading from
the Revised Standard.
Okay.
I thought I'd give it a little something
Switch it up a little bit. There you
go. All right. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose up, and every man stood at his tent door and looked after Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the door of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the door of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, every man at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tent.
Very good. Thank you for reading that. And the focus, of course, with our series is how it describes in this passage, how it describes Moses speaking to the Lord face to face. It says, as a man speaks to his friend. So it's describing God as being present in, or let's say a limited way, but in a unique way, in a tent. So we have like kind of a small space that he's meeting with Moses, and says face to face, and also says as a man speaks to his friend. So it is putting human-like qualities onto God in this circumstance. And I've often wondered, and this is something that's come up in this series, kind of over and over again as we look at these passages. I kind of understand a little bit with the golden calf, because that's kind of that story is it's kind of a full story, but why does God appear in this way to Moses in this circumstance, and also why does it mention it at all? I mean, I'm glad that it does mention this, but it's definitely an important detail that's thrown in. Because it could have just said that Moses talked to God, and that's usually where it kind of leaves off, just kind of says Moses speaks to God, but here it gives you this, Moses speaks to the Lord face to face. So why go out of the way to mention this, especially in the Old Testament? So I guess we'll start there with that question.
Well, can we give some context to
Yeah.
the this whole situation. Where does this take place compared to where and when does this take place exactly?
Right. So this is um, right after the golden calf episode, and they are still out in the wilderness. And I get the impression that this is sort of describing a habit or a not just one instance, but a period of time in which Moses would meet with God in this tent. And so they were somewhere out in the wilderness, during those would have been during those 40 years for sure. Um,
Early.
early, yeah, early, but this would have been before they made the ark and they had the tabernacle constructed. So, that was kind of those were kind of the circumstances. Um, and well, I did have one other question that did mention anyone who sought the Lord. So it was, but really, what were they seeking? Because they would just be kind of watching Moses go into the tent. Um, I mean, Moses
Oh,
would have been kind of an intermediary.
I
Oh,
mean,
what's
I
that?
got the impression that it was a tent available at other times, whether or not the cloud descended when they went in. I didn't think that was the case, but upon me hearing that passage, I think for the first time I've heard it, it sounds like people were able to seek that out whenever, uh, just as a place to go that's quiet to pray and such.
Well, yeah, it did say they would go out to the tent, but it also specifies that only Moses had this face to face interaction, um,
Yeah.
which, and I guess it's kind of the point of the series to answer these questions. But God is present everywhere, but also God is present in unique ways. When we look at Moses having this interaction, um, especially when we see these human attributes, you know, uh, that God could fit into a tent. God could be everywhere, but also inside a tent, talking with Moses face to face. So I did just kind of wonder, like, why. Yeah, I guess it does show the special relationship Moses had, the closeness that Moses had with God, and we're still in the Old Testament, so this was Moses was able to be in God's presence somehow without on a regular basis, even though he was not a perfect, he was not a perfect human. He was a human, so he was not perfect. Um, I know
I
in
just had
yeah,
um, maybe an interesting thought. It just seems that every time God speaks directly to someone in the Bible, it's like essentially it's in person or like through a messenger, a physical presence. Because it
yeah,
seems to me that um, it's kind of typically felt maybe that like as one would pray to God, you might someday maybe like hear this voice in your head, like actually an answer or something. But as far as I know, that's never actually the case in the Bible, where he just like speaks to you in your own head. Maybe,
Well, they do
but
hear a
usually it's like,
voice. People do
oh
hear
yeah,
a voice, but
hmm,
like when Samuel hears God calling, and wakes him up, and but it doesn't say, it doesn't necessarily say he heard it in his head. It does say that he heard a voice.
yeah, hmm,
But this does hint at some kind of physical presence because it says face to face.
yeah. Um, and there's the cloud thing there. I don't know if the cloud's like a privacy
The
curtain
earthly
or
cloud.
just like an indicator, or just an indicator that important things are going on, or that God's there or whatever. But
Well, and I'm sure if somebody
yeah,
tried to go in while the cloud had descended, that they would not be allowed. I see it as kind of with the tabernacle, you had the Holy of Holies, and you could only go in at a certain time, and you had to be a priest and
hmm,
all that. So I don't necessarily see it as like when the cloud descended and Moses was in there, it was just, I see it as that just Moses was in there, and that you have a bunch of people standing around, kind of looking at this, but nobody's going in while the cloud is there. At least that's my impression.
And mine too. I think Joshua was there to make sure that people didn't come in.
yeah. What was that?
Inquisitive.
What was that said at the end there, kind of about Joshua? How like he didn't leave the tent or something?
Yeah, I got the impression
Yeah,
Joshua stayed at the tent of meeting.
like kind of stationed outside.
Yeah,
Hmm. Well, that's what was going on when Moses was on Mount Sinai, right? Joshua was kind of not in the camp with the people, but he wasn't up on the top of the mountain. He was somewhere in between.
Huh. Was Joshua the one that alerted Moses of what was going on down in the camp?
Yeah, he said he heard the sound of. He said he heard them, but he didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
Um,
Or well, no, I'm sorry. God alerted Moses of that.
and then
yeah.
Moses started coming down. Then he ran into Joshua on the way
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
Uh,
But anyway, that was last week.
yeah, I mean, that's still kind of. It seems like he's sort of between the people and Moses. It seems when Moses is talking with God. Um,
Yeah.
so why mention? I guess what I find really unique about this passage is, why mention the face to face, and then also, as a man speaks to his friend. Um,
Yeah.
why? Do you have any thoughts, Bill? Why make this? Because I mean, it could
I
just
don't
say
know. I
that
mean,
he's.
it certainly builds Moses up in the eyes of men.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Well, I always thought that God, and it appears, God had a special task for Moses from the beginning. and Moses' task is not over. If you recall, the people were afraid to go up to God. They wanted Moses to go for them. Moses in these early years was the intermediary between God and his people. And of course, the first 5 books of the Bible are ascribed to the writings of Moses. Moses did hold a special place with God and with the people. And I think this was to some extent, protect the people from doing or saying something stupid.
I could kind of see that. Yeah. Forgot what I was going to say there for a second. I wonder how Moses was able to be in Moses and others. I mean, who we will talk about, who will interact with God. Yeah, because it is different, a little different for us because we know that we've received God's forgiveness. Yeah, but did God see did God overlook Moses's imperfections? I guess is what I'm getting at. Or provide some sort of atonement for Moses's sins so that he could be in God's presence during these times. As we'll see later on in the next section, Moses asks to see God's glory, or like the fullness of God's glory, but then God says, you can't see the whole fullness of it, but I'll pass before you. And he's kind of hides him behind a rock, and then he kind of can look as God passes by. But I guess that's kind of like a core thing that a lot of people mention with why God provided Jesus for the forgiveness of our sins, and that God can't tolerate the presence of sin. So I mean, Moses was a pretty good guy, of course, but he wasn't, he wasn't perfect, but yet he still had this very close relationship with God, as it says, as a friend. Like he was able to have this like casual, to me, it kind of says like a casual conversation.
Yeah, well, I think kind of I don't want to say well, kind of holes in the perfection of knowledge about understanding the Bible and stuff like that, such as we're kind of talking about right here. I made like a mental connection between Star Wars and the Bible because maybe not in any conventional sense, but because take with Star Wars, and it's a little bit less so recently, but like when the original 3 movies came out or whatever, I obviously wasn't around for that happening, but as they existed, there was just like, it was kind of like a glimpse into like a whole other world you were given little bits and pieces, but it was left up to your imagination to fill in the holes, which really
Yeah.
engaged your imagination, and it lent a sense of like awe and wonder to the whole thing. Like, because it was this like kind of permeable knowledge, like imperfect knowledge. It wasn't completely fleshed out, and left up. It was left up to the imagination,
Oh, okay.
which I think is
Okay.
somewhat
Yeah.
true of like books, and I think it's somewhat true of like black and white photos and TV shows compared to color TV shows and color photos. That's why you get that kind of, in some sense, or in some cases, often like an additional kind of sense of awe with black and white photos. It's because it forces your imagination to engage itself at some level. And I think you can connect all of that with like the holes or the lack of perfection of the, or lack of completeness of the knowledge as the Bible presents it. Like, it's a lot of stuff is left up to discussion, and and the reason I was saying like with Star Wars, because Star Wars is coming out with all these new TV shows and everything, and
Yeah.
it's really filling in a lot of those holes, which is like the characters' backstories. To me, like I enjoyed, like, for instance, the Han Solo movie was really good in my opinion, but I kind of
Yeah. It was a.
like things like that being a mystery, or like kind of, oh, we'll
Yeah.
never know, that kind of sense is kind of cool, to some extent. And part of me didn't like so much of this stuff being fleshed out, because it kind of gets rid of that bit of that sense of awe. So maybe
Yeah.
that's why there are these holes in the way the Bible is presented.
Hmm. I mean, it is definitely something that makes you pause and consider,
And
like, what does that really mean? You know.
yeah, and that also, like,
Uh,
the kind of discussion we've had around why God is presented as perfect in his knowledge, but also displays emotions and stuff. Like, it's kind of like those two things don't really, in my mind, instantaneously jive with one another. Kind of lets you, leaves you to try to figure out how to make possibly mismatched pieces fit into a whole, which forces your imagination to kind of go into overdrive a little bit, and I don't know, or like try to explain it,
yeah, or at least consider.
or have discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's true. Because I mean, there is
Like,
kind of a
just think if the Bible was
theological.
just like literally like just a set of like perfectly laid out rules. I mean, we do have some rules, but what if it was just literally just cut and dry like a dictionary or something?
Hmm, yeah.
I mean, that would be the most effective way to transmit knowledge, kind of, in theory. But anyway,
Like a manual or something like that.
yeah. Why is it not just a user's manual for, you know, how to go to heaven or how to love God or something? I mean, I guess you can make the argument that it is, but what I'm saying is that it's not, because it isn't a user's manual. It is a story and many stories, even if they do have points.
Well, I think you can. Yeah, I think you can hide more depth. You can put more depth into a story for sure.
Hmm.
Like layers of meaning. And with a story, you can see something new every time
Yeah,
if it's a good story. Um,
Well, I
and I
think
guess with.
go on.
Oh, no, I was just saying that just with this in particular, I just have kind of, I guess it just in this instance, it just spurred a theological question. How was Moses able to go in and out from God's presence? Did God provide some sort of grace or forgiveness
yeah. I mean, and this is
retroactively toward,
a stupid
that
question, but
applied to
this is
Moses?
this is prior to like Jesus,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it would have to be some sort of, I mean, and the whole sacrifices that they made, were more symbolic. They didn't
Well, I mean, you can make that
take away
same.
the sins of the people for forever, like
Well,
the
you can make that
sacrifice
same
of
argument
Jesus.
like with everyone that lived prior to Jesus. Like, what is the for instance, what is the question would be? What's the explanation for like, did anyone prior to Jesus existing go to heaven ever?
I believe so. Yeah, I mean,
Because the answer to that question, I think, answers in large part the question we're asking here.
yes, I believe so. But then also, their souls would have existed past, the time that Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead, and
So were they
you know,
waiting? Is that conventional theory that their souls
there's
were
some
just hanging
thought
out?
on that they were in some sort of waiting situation. Um,
Hmm.
I is there a because I know certain Christian denominations believe in like the Old Testament people being um, liberated from this waiting area, if you know
Hmm.
what I mean. Like they weren't like in hell per se, but they
Sounds
weren't.
like similar to the concept of purgatory.
Yeah, they were kind of in something like that. Um, but I mean, it is somewhat of a. I mean, I guess it's called the harrowing of hell, but they weren't like in, like they weren't being tormented or anything like that. They were just kind of waiting. Um, so I guess that kind of answers that, but it doesn't necessarily answer how Moses and others, like, there were others who had interactions with, well, Abraham. I mean, we've talked about him before. How were these?
Well, is God um is he intolerant of sin when he comes to visit the earth entirely? Or I mean, is it just he's intolerant in when he's at home up in heaven? Uh
Well, I guess that is true because, like, how else could Jesus have come and been present among people? I mean, so I mean, this could just be a pre, like what's the term we used it? A theophany, like an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament,
hmm.
like a pre-incarnation appearance. Um, I mean, that could explain it, and it certainly seems like Moses is not seeing a spirit, but God is taking some sort of human form and appearing in the tent, much like much like with Abraham. Um, so I guess that was just kind of more of a question I had about these instances, and just the fact that Moses was able to kind of go in and out of God's presence, and it's never addressed that aside from the time that Moses, what does he do? Hit the rock and does
We're
something
not
that he
there
can't
yet.
go in. Yeah, well, but he can't go into the promised land. That's really the only time that it's mentioned that Moses, did something that he shouldn't have done. But we know that he probably was not 100%. without sin 100% of the time, even though he was the chosen person to be the, to be the intermediary. But so I guess there's some kind of measure of,
Yeah, I mean, he's still human.
yeah, yeah.
And then the whole concept of original sin or whatever.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Bill? What's your
I think God just he he wanted Moses to establish the people as a nation. And I think because of that, he cut Moses slack. Moses did love God and he was faithful. And his heart was appropriate for him to have that intimate communication with God. But like was pointed out, and we'll see later, Moses didn't make it into the promised land. Moses could still be an individual that could push God farther than he wanted to be pushed. And in these times, I think God just allowed Moses into that position because he needed Moses to lead these people and form them into a nation. And that was what he did.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I just was wondering where the source of the slack that was being cut was coming from, you know.
The source of the slack,
Yeah.
I think that was merely the task that he wanted Moses to perform. He cast Moses in a role, and for Moses to fulfill that role, God and Moses really needed a relationship because God wanted the people to understand that you could have a relationship with God.
And this was something I kind of wrestled with when I was looking at this passage this week. Um, how exactly does this apply to us? Because we don't, and some might disagree with this, but we don't necessarily need an intermediary, you know, because
No, we don't need an intermediary now.
the curtain was torn, so to speak, and so should we see ourselves in Moses's position? That since we're not the people gathering around looking at the tent,
Well,
is
I
this
think
kind
that
of a
it does set up the precedent, and maybe this is the first time it's set up like that. But I mean, that little hut that he set up or tent is very similar to like a church, that the people can go access, and it's like a place set aside for that. And
yeah?
I don't know, is that the first time that that's set up officially like this? Because we would be in the position of the people where it's not like we go to church or to a tent out in the woods and
Yeah.
expect God to physically show up, but people would go to church and expect to work on
Well,
to
I mean,
work on their
yeah, I mean,
relationship there ish thing.
ideally, I mean, you should be able to commune with, yeah, I mean, the church is a special place for like corporate, group worship of God and encountering God as a group of people. Um, oh, so what is this kind of a story that I was reminded of, and this is hopefully not a big tangent, but it has to do with this. When I was lifeguard back in several years ago. Anyway, there was a guy there that we were talking. He was older. He was saying that he didn't. He gave some good reasons why he didn't go to church and or be involved in that. He's like, well, like the woods, being out in the forest, being out in nature is not church. And, I don't think it's like we're supposed to choose between the two. I think you're supposed to do both. You're supposed to have your own personal space that you go, to pray and seek God, but also you have the church where you're with other people.
Yeah, I
And
mean that
God is
certainly
present in
serves a
both
purpose from the
circumstances.
social interaction
Yeah,
standpoint as well.
yeah.
Um,
But yeah, it is interesting that you mentioned that this is kind of the first time that there is like some sort of structure built, as far as I can tell, because
yeah, I mean, is this the first church-ish?
well, you have this, yeah,
Halfway
you
through
have
the
this tent,
concept.
then you have the tabernacle that's built, and then later on you have the temple that's built, and then you have, synagogues that are kind of, I don't know if you would consider them like branches, or they were kind of like the local spots, but they weren't like the temple. And then you have churches being built later on. Um, but yeah, this is the first time I think you see like a space or a place being mentioned, aside from people building like altars and piles of stones and stuff like that. Um, because you do
Yeah.
see that, you
Well,
do see,
altars is where I think it's kind of presented where you go to like worship God, isn't not like have any kind of relationship with him necessarily.
yeah,
At least
yeah,
I feel like that's how it's presented earlier on, except for like the very special people. Um, but then this is perhaps the beginning of the concept where the individuals go have a more,
unless you consider the Garden of Eden as a
I
structure. But
suppose, yeah.
yeah, this is the first man-made structure that I see in the Old Testament, at least.
Hmm.
I mean, well, God did meet Abraham in a tent, but it wasn't like a tent that was built for that purpose. It was just like the tent he was living in.
Yeah.
So, that is an interesting observation you make there.
Well, it was not like all of the people gathered there. Uh, the way the text seems to read to me is that individuals could go out there uh, to talk and perhaps, commune and have worship, but it wasn't for the community to go and worship together.
Yeah, it wasn't like a structured assembly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. So I'm wondering, just kind of drawing applications for us I do kind of see a similarity to having a specific place where you pray, because prayer is a conversation with God. Um, so I can kind of see that in this. And, the fact that we don't, that we don't need the intermediary anymore, so that does kind of put us in Moses's position where we have this relationship with God, and ideally it should be like a face-to-face conversation. Um, and the fact that just like with the people then, God was with them generally speaking, because God was present everywhere also, but it is important to have specific times and places in which you go to seek God and go to have a conversation with God. At least that's kind of what I see in this. And um, I mean, it is intriguing to see Moses having this kind of, having this relationship with God and being able to talk face to face. But it does kind of seem like that should be something that we should do also. Do you see any
Yes,
other applications for this, other than it's just an interesting, it's an interesting detail.
I think God all along intended to spend time with us each. Uh, I think he wanted people to come out from the community to the tent. Uh,
Do you see any other examples in the Old Testament? I was thinking maybe David, of people who had this kind of almost like a one-on-one relationship, because there were people who would speak with angels and messengers, um, like the judges in the book of Judges, or prophets would receive words or visions. Well, I guess prophets would kind of, but that was more, when you look at the prophets, it was more just God telling them, okay, this is what you're going to do, you know. Um, and they could say yes or no, but it was kind of more of a, this is what you need to do. This is what you're going to, this is what you're going to say. And um, I'm thinking David's the only example I can really think of. Um,
yeah, David's the only example I can think of right offhand.
yeah. Hmm. But then, of course, everything changes in the New Testament and today. But, just looking at these Old Testament instances, it was, now this is just kind of a theoretical question, but could there be other people that we don't know about that, well, Enoch, actually, Enoch.
Well, yeah,
Enoch. Could there be other people and it's that aren't recorded? Um, that maybe like
yeah,
regular everyday people that had interactions with God that it's not given to us just because it's not something we need to know about. But surely there were more people than just Enoch and Moses and David and Abraham.
yes,
I mean, surely.
I think so. I think so. And the reason I think that is because this book is just given to us. We were talking, as a roadmap, a guidebook to God. And I don't think it is an exhaustive text of who related to God and who didn't.
Or even people we know about. Like we're going to be talking about Job in a few weeks, in the book of Job.
Yes,
He was a guy that would seek God frequently, and he kind of was in this earlier than this actually time period, but um, it doesn't say the extent of his interactions with God, but it does kind of hint that God had some sort of special relationship with him. Um, so just
that's true.
something to consider. Um, so definitely have a special place and time in which you seek, that you seek God and that you, and I think this is kind of an ideal picture, have a face to face conversation. Because I mean, you can't deceive, you can't put on airs when you're talking to God because God already knows the truth, so you are kind of, you can't not be truthful, so
That's, you're right.
yeah. So
Well, I think I was saying that last week, right?
yeah, and I
Yeah,
was I was kind of thinking about that too, that yeah. um any other things to mention here? We are going to be going into, I believe it's Exodus 34 next week, um, where Moses is allowed to, God puts Moses in the side of a cliff and comes by, and um, that's another interesting, very unique circumstance there. But we'll talk about that next week. But that's what we'll be looking at next week. Um, and it does describe some interesting things about the form of God, you know, like a human form. So
Huh.
it definitely fits in with our series for sure. Um,
Interesting.
so anyway, uh, that will conclude this week's discussion, episode 39. And thank you for listening. And we will talk to you next week.